Chapter 2. Paddington Cleans Up. Paddington peered through the letterbox at number 32 Windsor Gardens with a look of surprise on his face. In point of fact, he'd been watching out for the postman, but instead of the blue-grey uniform he'd hoped to see, Mr. Curry, the Browns' next-door neighbour, had loomed into view. Mr. Curry looked as if he was in a bad temper. He was never at his best in the morning, but even through the half-open flap, it was plain to see he was in even worse mood than usual. He was shaking a rug over the pavement, and from the cloud of dust surrounding him, it looked as though he'd been cleaning out his grate and had just had a nasty accident with the ashes. The expression on his face boded ill for anyone who happened to come within his range of vision, and it was unfortunate that his gaze alighted on the Browns' front door at the very moment when Paddington opened the letterbox.
"There!" he bellowed. "How dare you spy on me like that? I have a very good mind to report you."
Paddington let go of the flap as if it had been resting on hot coals, and he gazed at the closed door with a very disappointed air indeed. Apart from an occasional catalogue, he didn't get many letters, but all the same, he always looked forward to seeing the postman arrive, and he felt most aggrieved at being deprived of his morning's treat, especially as he'd been half expecting a postcard from his Aunt Lucy in Peru. Something she'd said when she'd last written had given him food for thought, and he was anxiously awaiting the next instalment. All the same, he knew better than to get on the wrong side of Mr. Curry, so he decided to forget the matter and pay his daily visit to a nearby market in the Portobello Road instead. A few minutes later, having taken his shopping basket on wheels from the cupboard under the stairs, he collected Mrs. Bird's shopping list, made sure the coast was clear, and set out on his journey. Over the years, Paddington's basket on wheels had become a familiar sight in the market, and it was often much admired by passers-by. Paddington took great care of it. It several times varnished the basket-work, and the wheels were kept so well oiled there was never a squeak. Earlier in the year, Mr. Brown had bought him 2 new tyres, so all in all, it still looked as good as new. After he had completed Mrs. Bird's shopping, Paddington called in at the baker's for his morning supply of buns. Then he carried on down the Portobello Road in order to visit the antique shop belonging to his friend, Mr. Gruber. Paddington liked visiting Mr. Gruber. Apart from selling antiques, Mr. Gruber possessed a large number of books, and although no one knew if he'd actually read them all, it certainly seemed as though he must have, for he was a mine of information on almost every subject one could think of. When he arrived, he found Mr. Gruber sitting on the horsehair sofa just inside his shop, clutching a particularly large volume. "You'll never guess what today's volume is about, Mr. Brown," he said, holding it up for Paddington to see. "It's called Diseases of the Cocoa Bean, and there are over 750 pages. Paddington's face grew longer and longer as he listened to Mr. Gruber recite from the long list of things that could happen to a cocoa bean before it actually reached the shops. He always rounded off his morning excursions with a visit to his friend, and Mr. Gruber's contribution to the meeting was a never-ending supply of cork, which he kept at the ready on a small stove at the back of the shop. It didn't seem possible that this could ever come to an end. "Perhaps we'd better get some more stocks in, Mr. Gruber," he exclaimed anxiously. Then there was a gap in the conversation. Mr. Gruber smiled. "I don't think there's any risk of our going short yet a while, Mr. Brown," he replied, as he busied himself at the stove. "But I think it does go to show how we tend to take things for granted. We very rarely get something for nothing in this world." Paddington looked slightly relieved at Mr. Gruber's reassuring words. All the same, it was noticeable that he sipped his cork even more slowly than usual, and when he'd finished, he carefully wiped around his mug with the remains of a bun in order to make sure he wasn't letting any go to waste. Even after he'd said goodbye to Mr. Gruber, he still had a very thoughtful expression on his face. In fact, his mind was so far away, it wasn't until he rounded a corner leading into Windsor Gardens that he suddenly came back to earth with a bump as he realised that while he'd been in the shop, someone had pinned a note to his shopping basket. It was short and to the point. It said, "Your shopping basket on wheels is in such good condition, it shows you have character, drive and ambition. This means you are just the kind of person we are looking for. You could earn £200 per week with no more effort than it takes to visit the grocer's. I will be in touch soon with further details." It was written in large capital letters and was signed "Yours truly, a well-wisher." Paddington read the note several times. He could hardly believe his eyes. Only a moment before, he had been racking his brains to think up ways of earning some extra money so that he could buy Mr. Gruber a tin or two of cocoa. And now, out of nowhere, came this strange offer. It couldn't have happened at a better moment, especially as he'd been tempted to break into the savings which he had kept in a secret compartment of his suitcase, and which he held in reserve for important occasions like birthdays and Christmas. It was hard to believe he could earn so much money simply because he'd kept his shopping basket clean. But before he'd had a chance to consider the matter, he saw a man in a fawn raincoat approaching. The man was carrying a large cardboard box which seemed to contain something heavy, for as he drew near, he rested it on Paddington's basket while he paused in order to mop his brow. He looked Paddington up and down for a moment and then held out his hand.
"Just as I thought," he exclaimed. "It's nice when you have a picture of someone in your mind and they turn out exactly as you expected. I'm glad you got my note. If you don't mind me saying so, sir, you should go far."
Paddington held out his paw in return. "Thank you, Mr. Wisher," he replied, "but I don't think I should go very far this morning. I'm on my way home." He gave the man a hard stare. Although he was much too polite to say so, he couldn't really return the man's compliments. From the tone of the letter, he'd expected someone rather superior, whereas this new acquaintance looked more like a trifle seedy. Catching sight of Paddington's glance, the man hastily pulled his coat sleeves down over his cuffs.
"I must apologise for my appearance," he said, "but I've got rid of... I've obtained so many new clients for my vacuum cleaners this morning, I don't know whether I'm coming or going. I haven't even had time to go home and change."
Your vacuum cleaners?" exclaimed Paddington, in surprise. The man nodded.
"I must say, sir," he continued, "it's your lucky day. It just so happens that you've caught me with my very last one, until I take delivery of our new batch later on, of course," he added hastily.
Taking a quick glance over his shoulder, he produced a piece of pasteboard which he held up in front of Paddington's eyes for a fleeting moment before returning it to an inside pocket.
"My card," he announced, "just to show that all's above board and Sir Garnet-like. You too could become a member of our happy band and make yourself a fortune. Every new member gets, free of charge, our latest model cleaner, and for today only, a list of do's and don'ts for making your very first sale. Nah," he slapped the box to emphasise his point, "I'm not asking £40 for this very rare privilege. I'm not asking 35, not even asking 30. To you, because I like the look of your face, and because I think you're just the sort of bear we're looking for, £25.
His voice took on a confidential tone.
"If I was to tell you the names of some of the people I've sold cleaners to, you probably wouldn't believe me. But I won't bore you with details like that. You're probably asking yourself what you have to do in order to earn all this money, right? Well, I'll tell you. You sell this cleaner for £30, right? You then buy 2 more cleaners for £25 each and sell them for 30, making £15 in all, right? Then you either keep the money or you buy 6 more cleaners and sell those. If you work hard, you make a fortune so fast you won't even have time to get to the bank. Another thing you may be asking yourself," he continued, before Paddington had time to say anything, "is why anyone who already has a vacuum cleaner should buy one of ours." He gave the box another slap. "Never fear, it's all in here. Ask no questions, tell no lies. With our new cleaner, you can suck up anything. Dirt, muck, ashes, soot, pile it all on, anything you like. A flick of the switch and whoosh, it'll disappear in a flash. But," he warned, "you'll have to hurry. I've got a queue of customers waiting around the next corner."
Paddington needed no second bidding. It wasn't every day such an offer came his way, and he felt sure he would be able to buy an awful lot of cocoa for £15. Hurrying behind a nearby car, he bent down and opened his suitcase.
"Thank you very much,"
said the man, as Paddington counted out 25 shiny £1 coins.
"Sorry I can't stop, Gov, but work calls."
Paddington had been about to inquire where he could pick up his next lot of cleaners, but before he had a chance to open his mouth, the man had disappeared. For a moment, he didn't know what to do. He felt very tempted to take the cleaner straight indoors in order to test it out in his bedroom, but he wasn't at all sure Mrs. Bird would approve. In any case, number 32 Windsor Gardens was always kept so spotlessly clean that there didn't seem much point. And then, as he reached the end of the road, the matter was suddenly decided for him. Mr. Curry's front door shot open, and the Browns' neighbour emerged once again carrying a dustpan and brush. He glared at Paddington.
"Are you still spying on me, Bear?" he growled. "I've told you about it once before this morning."
Oh no, Mr. Curry, said Paddington hastily. I'm not spying on anyone. I've got a job. I'm selling a special new cleaner. Mr. Curry looked at Paddington uncertainly.
Is this true, Bear? He demanded.
Oh yes, said Paddington. It gets rid of anything. I can give you a free demonstration if you like. A sly gleam entered Mr. Curry's eyes.
As a matter of fact, he said, it does so happen I'm having a spot of bother this morning. I'm not saying I buy anything, mind, but if you care to clear out the mess, I might consider it.
Paddington consulted the handwritten list of instructions which was pinned to the box. He could see that Mr. Curry was going to come under the heading of customers. Very difficult. I think, he announced, as a Brown's neighbour helped him up the step with his basket on wheels, you're going to need what we call the full treatment. Mr. Curry gave a snort.
It better be good, Bear, he said. Otherwise I'll hold you personally responsible.
He led the way into his dining room and pointed to a large pile of black stuff in the grate.
I've had a bad fall of soot this morning, probably to do with the noise that goes on next door, he said meaningly.
My cleaner's very good with soot, Mr. Curry, said Paddington eagerly. Mr. Wisher mentioned it specially.
Good, said Mr. Curry. I'll just go and finish emptying my dustpan, and then I'll be back to keep an eye on things.
As the Brown's neighbour disappeared from view, Paddington hurriedly set to work, remembering the advice he'd been given a short while before. He decided to make certain he gave Mr. Curry a very good demonstration indeed. Grabbing hold of a broom which was standing nearby, he quickly brushed the soot into a large pile in the middle of the hearth. Then he poked the broom up the chimney and waved it around several times. His hopes were speedily realised. There was a rushing sound, and a moment later an even bigger load of soot landed at his feet. Ignoring the black clouds which were beginning to fill the room, Paddington removed the cardboard box from his basket and examined Mrs. Bird's shopping. As he had feared, some of it had suffered rather badly under the weight, and he added the remains of some broken custard tarts, several squashed tomatoes, and a number of cracked eggs to the pile. It was while he was stirring it all up with the handle of the broom that Mr. Curry came back into the room. For a moment he stood as if transfixed.
Bear! He bellowed. Bear! What on earth do you think you're doing?
Paddington stood up and gazed at his handiwork. Now that he was viewing it from a distance, he had to admit it was rather worse than he had intended. It's all part of my demonstration, Mr. Curry, he explained, with more confidence than he felt. No, he said, putting on his best salesman's voice as he consulted the instructions again. I am sure you will agree that no ordinary cleaner would be any good with this mess. For once in his life, it seemed that Mr. Curry was in complete and utter accord with Paddington.
Have you taken leave of your senses, Bear? He spluttered.
Paddington gave the cardboard box a slap. No, Mr. Curry, he exclaimed. Never fear, it's all in here. Ask no questions, I'll tell no lies. Mr. Curry looked as if there was a good many questions he was only too eager to ask, but instead he pointed a trembling finger at the box.
Never fear, it's all in here, he bellowed. It better all be in there. It's not all in there within 30 seconds. I shall...
Mr. Curry paused for breath, suddenly at a loss for words. Taking advantage of the moment, Paddington opened the lid of the box and withdrew a long piece of wire with a plug on the end. He peered at the skirting board. Can you tell me where your socket is, Mr. Curry? He inquired. If Paddington had asked the Brown's neighbour for the loan of £1 million, he couldn't have had a more unfavourable reaction. Mr. Curry's face, which had been growing redder and redder with rage, suddenly went a deep shade of purple as he gazed at the object in Paddington's paw.
My socket, he roared. My socket? I haven't any sockets, Bear. I don't even have electricity. I use gas.
Paddington's jaw dropped, and the plug slipped from his paw and fell unheeded to the floor as he gazed at the Brown's neighbour. If Mr. Curry's face had gone a deep shade of purple, Paddington's, or the little that could be seen of it beneath his fur, was as white as a sheet. He wasn't sure what happened next. He remembered Mr. Curry picking up the cardboard box as if he was about to hurl it through the window, but he didn't wait to see any more. He dashed out through the front door and back into number 32 Windsor Gardens as if his very life depended on it. To his surprise, the door was already open, but it wasn't until he cannoned it to Mr. Gruber that he discovered the reason why. His friend was deep in conversation with the other members of his family. For some reason, they seemed even more pleased to see him than he was to see them.
There you are, said
Mrs. Bird. Thank goodness, said Mrs. Brown thankfully. Are you all right? chorused Jonathan and Judy. "Oh, I think so," gasped Paddington, peering over his shoulder as he hastily closed the door behind him.
"No one's tried to sell you a vacuum cleaner?"
asked Mrs. Bird. Paddington stared at the Browns' housekeeper in amazement. It really was uncanny the way Mrs. Bird knew about things.
"There have been goings-on down at the market this morning, Mr. Brown," broke in Mr. Gruber. "That's why I popped in. Someone's been selling dud vacuum cleaners, and when I heard you'd been seen talking to him, I guess I began to get worried."
"When you were so late back, we thought something might have happened to you," said Mrs. Brown. "Well," said Paddington vaguely, "I think it has." Paddington launched into his explanations. It was a bit difficult, partly because he wasn't too sure how to put some of it into words, but also because there was a good deal of noise going on outside. Shouts and bangs, and the sound of a loud argument, followed a moment or so later by the roar of a car drawing away.
"Fancy trying to take advantage of someone like that,"
said Mrs. Bird grimly, when Paddington had finished. "He seemed quite a nice man, Mrs. Bird," said Paddington.
"I didn't mean the vacuum cleaner salesman," said Mrs. Bird. "At least he gave you something for your money, even if it didn't work. I mean Mr. Curry. He's always after something for nothing."
"He's too mean to get his chimney swept for a start," said Judy. "And I bet he's still waiting to see if electricity catches on before he changes over," agreed Jonathan. They broke off as the telephone started to ring, and Mrs. Bird hurried across the hall to answer it.
"Yes," she said after a moment. "Really? Yes, of course. Well, we'll do our best," she added after a while. "But it may not be for some time. Probably later on this morning."
The others grew more and more mystified as they listened to their end of the conversation. "What on earth was all that about?" asked Mrs. Brown, as her housekeeper replaced the receiver.
"It seems," said Mrs. Bird gravely, "that the police think they may have caught the man who's been selling the dud vacuum cleaners. They want someone to go down and identify him."
"Oh dear," said Mrs. Brown. "I don't really like the idea of Paddington being involved in things like that."
"Who said anything about Paddington?" asked Mrs. Bird innocently. "Anyway, I suggest we'll have a nice hot drink before we do anything else. There's no point in rushing things."
The others exchanged glances as they followed Mrs. Bird into the kitchen. She could be very infuriating at times, but the Browns' housekeeper refused to be drawn, and it wasn't until they were all settled around the kitchen table with their second lot of elevenses that she brought the matter up again.
"It seems," she mused, "that the man they arrested was caught right outside our house. He was carrying a cleaner at the time. He said his name was Murray, or Hurry, or something like that. Anyway, he insists we know him."
"Crumbs!" exclaimed Jonathan, as light began to dawn. "Don't say they picked on Mr. Curry by mistake." "I bet that's what all the row was about just now," said Judy. "I bet he was coming round here to complain."
"Which is why," said Mrs. Bird, when all the excitement had died down, "I really think it might be better if Paddington doesn't go down to the police station. It might be rubbing salt into the wound."
"I quite agree," said Mr. Gruber. "In fact, while you're gone, perhaps young Mr. Brown and I can go next door and clear up some of the mess." "Begs we help too," said Jonathan and Judy eagerly. All eyes turned to Paddington, who was savouring his drink with even more relish than usual. What with Mr. Gruber's book on diseases and the disastrous events in Mr. Curry's house, he'd almost begun to wonder if he would ever have any elevenses again. "I think," he announced, as he clasped the mug firmly between his paws, "I shall never take my cocoa for granted again."